Hi. I think I'm not one who was born for technology, so we're going to have to go through this together. So I've got my video up. Oh, I can see the chat. Yeah, I think we're good. So, hello, everybody. My name is Margaret Stockton-Davies. I'm a tour guide here in London working with free tours by foot. I was invited to come here to have a bit of a chat, answer any questions you might have, also tell you a little bit about myself and about London. So, yes, as I said at the beginning, in case you got cut off, I am a historian. I deal with things from the past. Technology is very much current and present, and I'm not so knowledgeable. So bear with me if I totally destroy everything that I'm trying to do right now. One of the questions that I get asked a lot by people who come on my tours is, how did I become a tour guide working in London? I also get asked something that you probably have recognized by now, is that clearly from the way I'm speaking, I'm not actually from London. So I was born in the US, in California. And I moved out to London. I don't want to say how long ago it was, in 2004, if we can all believe that that happened. It did. And I got my degree in British history. Now, as every history graduate can attest to, an undergrad in history doesn't unlock a lot of career doors for yourself. So I got a job as a receptionist. Brilliant, who didn't? And eventually ended up manage to snag a job at the Houses of Parliament, working in their visitor services department. And visitor services in Parliament was a new sort of organization. The idea was that we were supposed to facilitate access between Parliament and the public. So we would stand outside to answer people's questions, allow people to come in to watch the debates. We would take school groups around, and then also we would lead tours inside the Palace of Westminster, which, if you don't know, is where the Houses of Parliament are located. The best part of the job, hands down, was the tours. So eventually I decided that that is what I would like to go into full time. And luckily I was able to make it happen. So I've been with Free Tours by Foot now for 7 years. Yeah, 7 years this summer. I also will say that when I'm doing my tours, I get asked a lot of the same questions. The first question that everybody always asks is, when are we going to the toilet? Which luckily doesn't apply to today, so feel free to go whenever you like. I also get asked a lot about, how long is the tour going to be? Where we're going to finish? Are we going to, have a coffee break somewhere in the middle? But I also get asked a lot of repeated questions that come up quite a bit that don't actually have anything to do with the tours that I lead. So I thought what I would start to do is kind of go down that list, because I suspect there'll be at least a handful of people watching this wondering some of the answers to these questions. And I think top of the list is, I get asked a lot, where is the best place to get fish and chips in London? I will confess and say that people in Britain, of course, eat fish and chips, but it doesn't happen every night, which a lot of people seem to think that's all that we're eating. Also, if you live nearer to the coast, it's much more prevalent than it is. In London, we've got a river, but there's not too much in that river that you'd want to eat. So we're not necessarily a coastal town. So it can be a little bit tricky to find good fish and chips in London. Every pub will serve fish and chips, but that doesn't make it good. Where you really want to go is to a fish and chip shop. So a place where all they do is fish and chips. That's always going to be the best. And our favorite, and I'm saying our because it's not just me, but I've got guides that do tours in Camden and Soho and the East End. And also we do food tours in Shoreditch and Brick Lane. And so our recommendation always to all of our guests is going to be Poppy's Fish and Chips, run by a man called Poppy, surprise, who's been running it for decades now, actually. They, for a while, were the last fish and chip shop to actually wrap your fish and chips in newspaper. Eventually, it was discovered that the ink of the newspapers was bleeding into the food, which was poisoning people, so they stopped doing it, which I think you'll agree was a smart move. But he does have sort of like, when you get your box of fish and chips, it does have sort of newspaper-esque looking paper in it, so you can still get the true authentic experience. I will say that the original Poppy's is located just off Brick Lane in Shoreditch, but he's also opened a couple spots as well. There's one in Camden, there's one in Soho, and there's also one actually in Spitalfields Market. So very easy to find when you're here, and definitely worth seeking out They do not pay me to tell you this. It's legit. Another question that a lot of people want to know is, why does everybody in England drive on the wrong side of the road? My wife would counter that and question why everybody else drives on the wrong side of the road. But for now, we'll take it as this. The short and true answer about why things seem to be opposite on the streets here actually isn't known. We don't have 100% sort of reason why it became this way, but there's two prevailing schools of thought that I will go through with you, and you can decide which one you want to believe, or like what sounds better to you. I'll tell you what I tend to believe. So the first is the one that I'm necessarily not on board with, and this goes back to medieval times when you would have jousting on horseback, and of course most people being right-handed would be holding the swords in the right hand, and you want, of course, your sword as close to your opponent as possible. So if two jousters are riding towards one another, you're going to have your sword in your right hand, which meant that's the direction everybody was going in. The reason I don't necessarily buy this is because jousting was not strictly an English medieval sport. It happened in a lot of different countries, and they all drive on the other side of the road. So I don't know if I buy that one, but that is the reason that a lot of people give. The second, which I tend to put a little bit more weight into, has to do with something that happened here in London. And this was the creation of the London Bridge, not to be confused with Tower Bridge, which we might get into later, depending on how we go. London Bridge, actually, the current version was built in 1967, but there has been a bridge on that site here in London called the London Bridge since at least the year AD 43. So it's been a very long time. And the medieval bridge was so big and so heavy that pieces of it were constantly crumbling into the water. Hence, we believe London Bridge is falling down. That's where we think it comes from. Eventually, it fell down so many times that they scrapped it. There were numerous versions of London Bridge as time went on. And the Victorian one, I think, is the most famous because that was put up for sale in the 1950s and bought by a man in America who paid for it to be shipped out to the state of Arizona, where it was then rebuilt on a golf course in the town of Lake Havasu, where it still stands today, which weirdly means if you want to see the Victorian London Bridge, you have to go to the United States to do it. Now, the medieval bridge is linked to the side of the road that we walk on because, as I mentioned, London Bridge was so big and so heavy, and that's because it wasn't just a bridge, it was an actual street. And along this street, you had houses, people lived on top of it. There were two pubs, there were marketplaces, there was a church on it as well. It was a huge thoroughfare, but of course, being a bridge, it wasn't necessarily that wide. So there was a lot of congestion and traffic on the bridge. And eventually, as people were trying to make their way through, the mayor of London decreed officially that people going to the south side should be on the left side of the bridge, while people walking to the north side should be on the left side, their left side as well. So I suspect, if either one of those stories are true, by the way, because there's a lot of London history that's shrouded in sort of like myth and legend, I would say that one probably has the actual more likelihood, I would say, of being the actual story. I mentioned to you briefly as well not to confuse Tower Bridge with London Bridge. And this is because the two are very often confused. And the simple reason for this is because London Bridge is such a famous name. We all know it. We know the rhyme, like I mentioned earlier. And everybody who comes to London wants to see London Bridge. But when you think of a bridge in London, the bridge that you're actually thinking of course, is, let's see if I can get you here. Yeah, you can see this one right here. We know it. We all know this one. But this is Tower Bridge, not London Bridge, sadly, and often quite confused. Tower Bridge itself, it's newer, so it doesn't have a lot of, I would say, legend surrounding it. You don't have a lot of necessarily wildly interesting stories like you would with Tower Bridge, with London Bridge rather. Tower Bridge is Victorian. It was completed in 1894. It was originally painted in shades of blue because that was Queen Victoria's favorite color. And the bridge itself is a drawbridge. It does raise. Sometimes on my tours, we get to catch it. It's usually in the summertime. There's cruise ships that come in, or there's companies that do these really awesome things where you ride these old Thames clippers. They look like the Black Pearl out of Pirates of the Caribbean, and they raise the bridge. You get to come in and sail underneath. The bridge itself raises about 1,000 times a year, but 95% of that is in the summertime when we've got nice weather. So yeah, sometimes we get lucky on my tour. We get to see Tower Bridge opening. So yeah, if it's a history competition, then the award would definitely go to London Bridge. But if it's a beauty competition, that one would get handed to Tower Bridge. Here's another question that I get a lot, is that people always want to know if I've ever seen the Queen. I think when you think of London or England, one of the first thing that comes to your mind, of course, is the monarchy, the royal family. And the answer that I'm pleased to attest to is yes, I have seen the Queen. I've seen the Queen multiple times. I'm sure she's seen me multiple times as well. The first time I got lucky enough to see her was when I was working at the Houses of Parliament, because the Queen is actually 1/3 of the parliamentary process. So for those of you who live in the UK, I'm going to give you a crash course here on the way legislation works. For those of you visiting in the States or listening from other Commonwealth countries, you're going to notice a lot of similarities between this as well. So when we're talking about the Houses of Parliament, we're talking about 3 different things: the House of Lords, the House of Commons, and the Sovereign, who right now, of course, is the very fashionable and lovely Queen Elizabeth II. And as part of her role as part of the parliamentary process, she actually has to approve all the bills that are proposed by Parliament. So for any bill to become a law, the Queen has to give seal of approval. Small side note and slight spoiler, she always says yes. She never says no. We haven't had a monarch say no to Parliament since the 1700s, and that was Queen Anne. And the reason they don't do this is because of the English Civil War, which I'll get into a little bit later on. So the Queen always says yes. She's the one that gives final approval for all of our bills to become laws. And also, she is the one that officially opens Parliament at the start of every financial year. That has nothing to do with me. I'd like to highlight that. That's not for me. So yes, she opens Parliament at the start of every financial year, and as part of that, she reads what's called the Queen's Speech. If you've seen the film The King's Speech, you will know that's a little bit of a pun, a play on words. So the Queen does give a speech every year. The speech will not have been written by the Queen. It is written by the government, but she's the one that gets to, in brackets, has to read it out. And as part of that, she sits on her throne. She reads the speech. There's a lot more that goes into it. And one of the things that happens, of course, is that the House of Commons and the House of Lords want to listen to the speech. Now, the Queen has a seat in the House of Lords, but she doesn't have a seat in the House of Commons, because the House of Commons is run by the people, by us. We all elect representatives to sit in the House of Commons. The UK right now, this is subject to change at any moment, is cut up into 650 different categories. Oh, hi, Julie. Nice to see you. Staying inside, I hope. Drinking some wine, maybe? Yeah. Now, the UK is cut up into 650 different constituencies, and each constituency votes to represent somebody, to elect somebody rather, to represent them in the House of Commons. And that is how we end up with members of the House of Commons. They're chosen by us, by the people. The House of Lords, on the other hand, is not an elected chamber. It's an appointed chamber. And the Queen can appoint anybody who she wants to come and sit inside the House of Lords. Although I'd like to add that much like how the government writes the Queen's speech, the government are also the ones who recommend to the Queen who they think should be allowed into the House of Lords. So sometimes you do get a little bit of political bias in there. Conservative prime ministers tend to push more conservative people into the House of Lords. Although I will mention, differently than the House of Commons, the House of Lords also does have what we call cross-benchers, who are independent people who sit in the House, but they don't subscribe to any party lines whatsoever. So they can have what we would call a free vote. They vote without the party letting them know how they want them to vote. A lot of people think that the House of Lords is an inherited position, which it used to be. That is true. You would get a title. I wouldn't. I'm a woman. A man would have a title, and then it would go to his son and his son and his son, and so on and so on. You have this whole chamber filled with people who just turned up one day, basically. But now it is quite different. From the 90s, they abolished hereditary peerages. And so now, yes, you are appointed by the government, or well, by the Queen, who's been told by the government. And you have that job basically until you die. You actually hold on to it even if you're in prison, which we found out a few years ago during multiple scandals dealing with Parliament. But that's a different live stream. We're not going to do that now. So you've got the House of Lords, the appointed chamber, you've got the House of Commons, the elected chamber, and then you have the Queen. So on the day of the Queen's speech, the Queen is sitting in her throne inside the House of Lords, but of course the House of Commons isn't there, and the Queen's going to need them to come and see her and come hear the speech. But, the Queen's not going to walk through the palace, and go over and take a look at them and tell them, hey, you got to get in here. She's got other people to do that job. And the person whose job it is called the Gentleman Usher of the Black Rod, who, despite the name, can sometimes be a woman. And this is a person whose job it is to sort of liaise between the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And as the name might suggest, the Gentleman Usher of the Black Rod carries a big black staff, a nice big stick. And when the Queen is ready to read her speech, Black Rod will leave the House of Lords and he will walk straight down the corridor into what we call Central Lobby, which is the big room right in between the Commons and the Lords. Straight through the lobby, he turns up to the House of Commons, and then the doorkeepers in the House of Commons will shut the doors in his face. He is not permitted to just walk inside. So he will then take the big stick that he's got, his black rod, and he will bang it against the door 3 times. And once he's done that, they will open the door and allow him to come in. So then he or she, as the case may be right now, hello DC, will walk into the House of Commons and say that the Queen has requested, not demanded, but requested their attendance in the House of Lords. And the first thing that happens after Black Rod asks for their attendance is that everybody starts laughing and they start talking and they start making fun of him and they start saying like, well, I don't want to go to the House of Lords. Do you want to go to the House of Lords? Yeah, I guess we can go and see what, all right, come on, we'll get up and we'll go. And they walk to the House of Lords, complaining the entire time, laughing the entire time, making jokes the whole time. And the whole sort of point of all of this is, you'll remember I said the House of Commons works for us. We're the ones that have elected those people. They don't work for the Queen. No, they're there on our behalf. So the Queen can't command them to do anything. She can only request, and they're just, I'd say, amenable enough. No, amenable. Is that the word? Help me out. I'm not an English literature professor. Amenable to feel it within themselves that they will grant the Queen's request and they will attend her speech inside the House of Lords. And this, by the way, is the only time that all 3 parts of Parliament are ever together. It's always during the Queen's speech. What the speech entails is usually incredibly important, but also incredibly boring. It tends to be what the government's plan is going to be for the next year, which right now nobody knows. So we're going to just stop that right there. So have I seen the Queen? Yes, I've seen her at the Houses of Parliament. I saw her come to give a speech. It was fabulous. I think she caught my eye, not to brag. I saw her again walking through Parliament one other time. She's short. She looks like her grandma. She's just as lovely as you would think. And then for many lucky people on my Westminster tour, we see her on my tour a lot. And we kind of get a good idea of when we've got a chance to see the Queen, because, the Queen has multiple palaces and castles and everything throughout the country. But Buckingham Palace, of course, is the most famous, and that's included on our Westminster tour. Now, most of the time when we turn up at Buckingham Palace, there's a flag on the top, more sirens, again, not for me. I'm hoping. Let's see what happens. If this video ends with my arrest, I apologize. So there's always a flag on top of Buckingham Palace. And usually when I get my groups down there and we're looking at it, it's the Union flag, sometimes referred to as the Union Jack, which is the flag of the United Kingdom. And whenever that flag is flying on top of Buckingham Palace, it means that the Queen is not home. No, because that's the flag of the United Kingdom. It is not the flag of the Queen. The Queen has her own flag. right? She doesn't share a flag with the rest of the country. No, she's got her own personal flag. It's called the Royal Standard, and I have a picture of it here that I'm going to show you. And this here is the Queen's personal flag. So the red squares with the lions represent England. The yellow square with the red lion represents Scotland, and the blue square with the harp is Northern Ireland. So this is her official flag, the Royal Standard. And whenever that flag is flying on top of Buckingham Palace, we know that the Queen is home. And we also then know that we might get a chance to see her coming or going. So yes, occasionally we do get to see Her Majesty. So I've had a good question here asking about trying the best of London food. So if you have just joined us, the first thing that I mentioned was about fish and chips in London. We all love it. And I recommended Poppy's, Poppy's fish and chips, my absolute favorite. All they do is fish and chips. They're the best in the game, and they've been here for decades. Also, other sort of London food, pie and mash is incredibly popular. Oh, we love a pie and mash. And pie and mash usually best comes at different pubs. And there's all sorts of different pies that you can get. There's meat pies, there's vegetarian pies, there's even vegan pies that you can get now. You've got shepherd's pie and cottage pie, everything. But the most, I'd say, traditional, the most well-known is steak and ale pie. And as the name might suggest, it is made with steak and ale. So it's usually cubed beef in an ale sauce wrapped in puff pastry. Absolutely delicious. Usually served with mashed potatoes on the side. Sometimes they'll throw some peas in there as well, try to get your vegetable, but it's not guaranteed. If you want to check out sort of steak and ale pie or any other pie here in London, there's 3 places that I'm going to mention to you that I think are worth remembering / writing down. Number 1 is called the Windmill. This is in Soho, and it's what we call a gastropub, which is a pub, but the emphasis is more on the food rather than the drinks. So you're going to want to hit up the Windmill. Theirs are really good, and they look beautiful. If you go to the Windmill on their Instagram, you will see the pictures, like huge puffs of paste. They're absolutely massive, and like all the gravy dripping out the sides. Stunning and delicious. So they're really good. My second recommendation, and this isn't, by the way, these pies are not in order 1, 2, 3. They are all equally delicious. So my second recommendation is the Princess of Wales. This is a pub on Villiers Street. If you happen to come along with me on, any of my tours, but particularly my all-in-one tour, I take you guys for lunch at Villiers Street. And when we get to Villiers Street, everybody gets to go wherever they want. There's loads of restaurants and pubs and things you can have, but the Princess of Wales is there, and it's always my top recommendation. So they always have steak and ale pie. They usually have a vegetarian option as well, and then depending on the day, they'll have different stuff. And they sometimes go a little bit avant-garde. They've had venison pie before as well that people on my tour have really enjoyed. So they're always worth a shout as well. They've got the main channels, they've got all the football and the rugby and everything like that. So if you want to get your pie and watch some English football, that's where you're going to want to go to do it. And then the last place I would recommend for pie actually doesn't have a place to go and sit in. Instead, they have different outposts at different food markets here. We've got a lot of good food markets here in London, and the main one is Borough Market, which is south of the river near London Bridge Station. There is a Borough tube station, but confusingly, that's not the one that's closest to the market. You want to go to London Bridge. And the place there is called Pie Minister, and they have the best sort of takeaway pies in the city. They come in little boxes, and they're small. They're smaller, so it's more a taste of or a flavor of what you would normally get if you sat down and had a big version. But they have all different types, flavors, and they all have cute names, usually with different puns. My favorite one is Catherine of Tarragon, which is chorizo and chicken inside a little puff pastry named after Catherine of Aragon. So yes, they have a stall at Borough Market. They also have one at Gabriel's Wharf, and then you see them popping up in places in different street food markets throughout town. Tips for checking out shows in the West End. Oh, absolutely. So London, of course, I mean, right now everything is in limbo, but we are home to one of the most amazing historical talented crew of theater performers here in the city. And if you want to check out the West End, which, in case you're wondering, is basically our version of Broadway, you know, it's where all the theaters are, then my favorite recommendation for you is to go to the tickets booth. Now that's TKTS. People who are watching this visiting from New York, I think will recognize they have an outpost there as well, same company. And they have a booth here in Leicester Square. Leicester Square is right in the heart of the city. It's surrounded by theaters. If you ever see the big movie premieres like Harry Potter, James Bond or stuff, those are the ones that happen in Leicester Square. And right there in the heart of Leicester Square is the tickets booth. And they work directly with the theaters. So they get the largest amount of tickets. They can set the prices based on demand, and you can get tickets right up until just a few minutes before the show actually starts. So you can grab your tickets and run through the rain to get to the theater in time. So they're my top choice. I would also recommend, and again, I'm not being paid by these people, just like, there's Today Tix, which is an app you can get on the phone. I think it's in the States as well, so some of you might know this as well, but you can download it, and they have a certain number of tickets that they are awarded for different performances every day. You can enter your name into drawings, so you can get £20 tickets. So Today Tix is really good. I've had some very good luck with them before. And the last thing I would mention, which you might not really think about, is lastminute.com. Lastminute.com sells hotel rooms, flights, things like that, but they also have tickets to West End shows. So you can actually find, if you're looking for something to do not too long from the time you're looking, it's a good place to kind of snag a bargain. I never knew that you could buy tickets there till my mother-in-law told me, because she's the one that knows where to get all the bargains. So yes, we got lucky there. So those are my top 3: tickets, Today Tix, and then lastminute.com if you want to get your hand on those theater tickets. We also have, I just want to give a small mention as well, because when you think of England, English literature and things, of course, you would think of William Shakespeare. Now, Shakespeare did live here in London, although his birthplace and primary home was in Stratford. But Shakespeare had a theatre here called the Globe Theatre, which was constructed in the 16th century, but then sadly burned down after a cannon shot off during a performance and lit the roof on fire, and the whole thing burned down. Now, in the 1970s, there was an American actor, Sam Wanamaker, who wanted to rebuild Shakespeare's Globe Theatre here in London. Now, at first, when he suggested rebuilding the Globe Theatre, everybody kind of laughed at him. They said he wants to go sit in an old medieval theater. He wanted to build it near the original location, which was right on the south bank. That's what we call the south side of the River Thames. And right now, the south bank is amazing. I always recommend to people on my tours, walk the south bank at night. You can see all the lights. Everything's lit up. You've got people playing music. There's pubs. You get street musicians. People make sort of sand castles down as you go along the river where the sand is. It's an incredible place to walk. But in the 1970s, it was just basically nothing. It was old abandoned warehouses. For those of you that read Dickens and you think of Oliver Twist and all the kids are, living in crime-filled streets and the old warehouses, that's where it took place, right there. And so you've got this random American actor who's saying, I'm going to rebuild Shakespeare's Globe Theatre, and basically this part of London that nobody ever wants to visit. So it was quite the challenge. But as time went on, he did manage to convince people that it would be a good idea. He managed to get funding from other fellow thespians who decided to believe in his cause. And eventually he did get permission to build the Globe Theatre. The Globe Theatre is the only building in London that has a wooden roof. After the Great Fire in 1666, which demolished all of medieval London, a law was placed that said that buildings could no longer have thatched or wooden roofs, which was a solid choice because London had burned down multiple times before then, and it took them 5 or 6 tries before deciding to do something to change it. And this was the law, and it worked a treat. We've never had any massive fires like that before. But this meant when Sam Wanamaker is applying for permission to build this thatched roof theater, he's being told no. And he was told no over and over again for the span of 30 years that he spent arguing with the council to get permission. The final compromise was that he was allowed to build his wooden theater, but with little sprinklers on the top, which you probably wouldn't notice unless somebody pointed it out to you. So keep an eye out if you do check it out. So yes, the Globe Theatre is an official recreation, an authentic creation of Shakespeare's original theater right here on the edge of the River Thames. And the most bittersweet note of all is that Sam Wanamaker was successful in getting this theater built, but he died just a few years before he could see it completed. And then where are we now? 3 years ago now, I think, the team behind the Globe opened the Sam Wanamaker Theatre, which is a Jacobean theatre that is indoors. So it used to be you could visit the Globe during the summertime, of course. You've got the roof has a big hole in it, in case you're unaware, so it's like a donut shape. So you wouldn't necessarily want to go there in the winter, so it was closed. But now they've rebuilt this Jacobean theater, so Jacobean period being just a little bit later than Shakespeare's, and the idea being that it's enclosed, so people can come and enjoy the theater in the winter as well. So yes, lots of theatre history here in London. I'm going to return to my list, which actually has my last question that I get asked quite frequently by visitors, which is, why are the soldiers at the Tower of London called the Beef Eaters? And there's a few, again, different stories for this, but there's one which is the truth, which is the one that I'm going to tell you now. So there are a group of soldiers that work at the Tower of London. Now, the Tower of London itself is a huge fortress. It is actually the oldest Norman building in London. And when we're talking Normans, we're talking 10, 1100s. The main part of the tower, the White Tower, was built and commissioned in 1071 by William the Conqueror. But as years have gone on, other kings and queens have added to it, expanded it. They wrapped walls around it, put new buildings inside of it. It's been the mint where money was manufactured. It was a prison. Sir Walter Raleigh, Sir Francis Drake, Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, they were all kept as prisoners here. It's also, for a while, it was the London Zoo before the zoo existed. In fact, King Henry III, going back 700 years now, Henry III had a pet polar bear that lived in the tower. He would tie a cord around its wrist and go fishing in the Thames. And Londoners would come down every day to watch this polar bear swimming around in the river. So the tower has gone through multiple transitions. But since the 1500s, it's also been the home of the Beef Eaters. Now, Beef Eaters are soldiers who can trace their origin back to the reign of Henry VII. So we're going back to the 1480s. I shortchanged him a couple decades there, 1480s. And Henry VII was very, we would say, good with money. We would say shrewd. We would also say cheap, or we would say stingy. Depends on what mood you're in. And so what he wanted to do was to gather all of his personal treasures and possessions and to keep them into one single location. So he knew everything that he had and where it was. Nobody could touch it and everybody could leave him alone. And the place that he decided to put it was inside the Tower of London. Right? Put it inside a castle. That's a perfectly reasonable idea. But he needs people to look after all of his jewels. And so he asks his soldiers, which at that time were called the Yeoman Guard. And he asked the Yeoman Guard to please move into the tower. And they had the full-time job of just looking after all of his stuff, making sure nobody took it, stole it, messed with it in any way. Now, Henry himself enjoyed a nice banquet now and again, and he would have a lot of those inside the tower. And whenever he had leftover food from his feasts and banquets, he would send it down to the yeoman wardens, and oftentimes that food would include beef, which today, beef, so I've already talked about, you can get beef pies anywhere. But in the 1500s, beef was expensive. Most people could only eat it once or twice a month. So the fact that those guys were getting fed beef every single night quickly spread throughout London. And quite rapidly after that, everybody stopped calling them the yeoman wardens. They started calling them the Beef Eaters, a nickname that has lasted 500 years and then some. So yes, today still known as the Beef Eaters, although as far as I know, they are not being provided with beef made at the tower. They do still live inside the Tower of London. There's a number of them. There's over 24 Beef Eaters that work and live at the tower. But one of them, am I allowed to have a favorite? I might. One of them has a very special job. And this is my favorite job in all of London, that if I couldn't be a tour guide, I would have this job. He is the Raven Master. Now, the current Raven Master, whose actual name is Chris, but Raven Master's awesome, is in charge of protecting the ravens at the tower. So I mentioned to you the tower used to be a zoo. It's been a prison. It's been a palace. It's been all this stuff. But since the 1600s, it's also been home to a number of ravens. Now, that might not seem like a really big deal to you, but the ravens in the tower are actually a huge deal. So back in the 1640s, there was a civil war fought, and I'm going to really boil this down to the basics. So don't pull me up on this, professors. I know what I'm talking about. I'm just going to make it easy here. The war comes down to the royal family, the King Charles I, and Parliament. After multiple skirmishes, battles lasting years and years, Parliament wins the war. They not only win the war, they defeat the king's army, they capture the king, and then they decide to publicly execute him. So bad times for King Charles I. Now, eventually, once the king is dead, it's decided that we're going to have what's called a protectorate. So you've got Oliver Cromwell, who was one of the leading commanders in the parliamentary army. He turns up and he becomes de facto king. They don't call him king, but that's what he is. He's in charge. He's doing everything. And eventually he died. That does happen. And his son, Richard Cromwell, wasn't necessarily prepared to fill his father's shoes. He was a bricklayer. He was not really interested in politics or parliament whatsoever. And also some people, this is a contemporary quote, said he was too ugly to be a public figure. If I could have a picture of anyone in history, that's right up there. I would love to know. So eventually, people decided, all right, well, Richard Cromwell's not a viable subject. We used to have a royal family. That might be kind of cool again. So maybe we can get the royal family back. So they do. They call up Charles the First son. Again, this is so oversimplified. I can't stress this enough. They call Charles II. They invite him back over to England. They say, hey, we'd love to give you the crown. Sorry about your dad. That's all over and done with. No hard feelings, right? Come on over. And of course he says, yeah, no hard feelings. That's great. I'd love to be king. So he's been hiding in France for decades. He turns up in England. Of course, the first thing that he does is confront and arrest everybody who had anything to do with his father's execution. And he kills all of them as well. And so Charles seizes the throne. But Charles never feels secure on the throne. Well, you wouldn't, would you, after seeing your family overthrown and your father beheaded? So he's very suspicious. He's very superstitious. He never quite feels settled and confident. And he hears a rumor that there's a woman living in the countryside who's a seer or a witch who's had a vision about his future. Now, of course, Charles wants to know exactly what's going to happen and when it's going to happen. So he demands that this woman be brought to him in London so he can hear about what her visions are. And what she tells him actually surprises him. And she tells him that she sees a vision that there are ravens living inside the Tower of London. Now, that doesn't seem like a big deal, but Charles was really into birds, not in a creepy way. And he had multiple royal aviaries, and he had a number of birds living in the tower, but this wasn't necessarily public knowledge. So the fact that this woman, and bearing in mind, this is before... Again, not me. This is before internet, TV, photos, Twitter. We know what Prince Harry's doing every minute of the day, but you didn't really know what the king was up to. So the fact that she's able to tell him, hey, there's ravens inside the tower, when she would really have no way of knowing, definitely impresses Charles. So he believes that she can see the future. And so he wants to know, all right, tell me what it is. What are you seeing? And so she says, all right, you've got these ravens are living in the tower, and that's great. But if the ravens ever leave the tower, then the monarchy will collapse. Now, obviously, to us, that sounds ridiculous, but Charles has already seen the monarchy collapse. It's happened. It happened to his father. So, of course, he's going to do everything he absolutely can to ensure that never happens. So he issues a royal decree that states that at all times there must be ravens living inside the Tower of London. And that royal decree still exists to this day. Ravens have lived in the Tower of London ever since. There has been times where it's been close. The tower was bombed during the Second World War. A number of the ravens were killed, but never entirely wiped out. And right now, yes, one of the yeoman warders, Chris, he is the current Raven Master, and it is his job to look after those ravens and to make sure that the history and monarchy stays safe inside the Tower of London. Now, the last sort of little story that I think I'm going to mention to you guys is about, again, the Tower of London. We're here, why leave? And I wanted to talk about the theft of the crown jewels. Now, the crown jewels themselves are a huge collection that, technically speaking, don't necessarily belong to the queen. They belong to the monarch, sort of as an institution rather than an individual. So you've got a number of crowns, you've got the scepters and the orbs and tiaras and jeweled swords and plates and goblets and anything you can possibly imagine. And all of it is held at the Tower of London, just like how Henry VII put all of his valuables there. So does the monarchy today. So it's a long-standing tradition that this is where the treasures are. Now, the crown jewels previously, medieval crown jewels, were at times held inside the tower, but not necessarily entirely until I mentioned Henry VII comes to the throne. So he keeps all the treasures there, and everything's good until that pesky civil war I mentioned to you a little bit before. So Parliament and Charles get into this fight. Parliament wins. They abolish the monarchy. And one of the things that Oliver Cromwell does is he orders the destruction of the crown jewels. absolutely just demolishes them, breaks it down, melts down the gold and the silver, keeps it for himself, gives it to friends, takes out the rubies, the diamonds, the sapphires. I will say a few very shrewd and brave people working at the tower at the time did manage to steal a few of the items and hide them away before they could be destroyed. They were handsomely rewarded later on in time, but quite the risk to take. Now, we have no crown jewels, of course, but we don't need them because Oliver Cromwell's not the king. He doesn't want anything like that. He's banning Christmas and music and any kind of fun you could possibly have, so he certainly doesn't want a fancy crown or any kind of necklaces. Now, eventually, as I've mentioned to you, Oliver Cromwell is dead and Charles II becomes the king. Charles's nickname now is the Merry Monarch. He had this nickname during his lifetime as well, because Oliver Cromwell had been so strict and totalitarian, and Charles turns up, he reopens the theaters, he starts the music, he brings up Christmas celebrations, he brings... He did a lot. I would say he opened all the brothels. That's a plus or a minus. Depends which side you're looking at. So he brings the fun, basically. And everybody's at first is really glad to have Charles back. He's bringing some much needed fun to everybody. People are feeling pretty good. But then Charles makes the very controversial decision to rebuild the crown jewels. And that might not seem like a really big deal, but of course, the country previously had gone through a civil war. A lot of people lose their land, they lose their money, people are living in wartime conditions. Then you've got Oliver Cromwell in. I don't want to say, he's an important person, and I believe he did the best that he could, but it's not like everybody's necessarily thriving under his protectorship. So Charles comes back. And people are saying, okay, it's like a breath of fresh air. We've got something new here to go. But Charles, the first thing he does is he decides that he's going to rebuild the crown jewels, but he's not going to use his own money because honestly, he doesn't have any. He's been living with his cousin, King Louis in France for 40 years. And so instead, he decides he's going to take public money, so taxpayer money. To recreate the crown jewels, which I think we can all agree was a lack of foresight with his PR department, which obviously didn't exist at the time. Now, Charles decides to build the crown jewels, and he ends up spending the equivalent of about 6 to 10 million pounds today. The pound is going up and down, so it's hard to make these conversions anymore, but a massive amount of public money. And everybody, of course, is absolutely outraged. Like, who are you to turn up after decades in France? You've come here, you've told us you're our king, and now you're spending our money. And he didn't mess around. Not only did he rebuild everything that was there before, he made more. He wanted everything. He's right down to little, diamond things to wear around his ankles and everything. He's in it. He's a party guy. He needs to look good for all his parties. So he's dumped all this money into all these jewels, and the public are absolutely fed up. And so Charles right now isn't that popular. No. At first, everybody was pretty glad to have him around, but now it's a blunder. It was totally the wrong move. People are really upset. But that would all change randomly later on in Charles' reign, not too long after he comes to the throne in the 1660s. And this was the theft of the crown jewels. And this was perpetrated by a man called Colonel Blood. I would like to highlight the fact that he was not actually a colonel. That's the name he gave himself, which I admire in a way. And he had decided that he was going to steal the crown jewels. Why not? He feels like, the country's paid for them. They're basically our crown jewels, so I should be allowed to have them. So he routinely makes visits to the tower. And the jewels tower have been on display to the public for years. So he, just like we do today, goes to the tower to see the crown jewels. So he does it a lot. He keeps going over and over again. He's scoping it out. He's seeing, oh, hello, Ruth. Yes, we would love you to come back to beautiful London. As soon as you can. Please do. Please come see us. So he's there at the tower. He's checking out the jewels. He's seeing the lay of the land. He works out who is in charge of the jewels, when they work, when they go to bed, what's going on. And eventually he and 3 other people manage to get into the tower at night, and they make their way to the crown jewels. The man who's in charge is there, but they knock him unconscious. They pry open the bars and they steal those jewels. They actually throw them into bags. It's reported that Colonel Blood actually smashed down the crowns so he could shove them into his pants so that he could have them there. So his pants are filled with jewels. So are all these bags, literally. And they're all running to get out of the tower. And it was a bad night to do so because the son of the person in charge of the crown jewels had been away, and he returned that evening. And when he walked into the tower, he was faced with Colonel Blood and his henchmen running out. And he sounded the alarm, and Colonel Blood was arrested. Well, What does that have to do with Charles? What does that have to do with his popularity? And, what does that have to do with anything? Well, the thing that happens is that Colonel Blood is taken to jail. And the king is notified. There's this man, he's attempted to steal your crown jewels. And while this is going on, the public start to hear about this. The word is spreading like wildfire. The jewels have been stolen. There was a man trying to get them, but luckily he was captured. And suddenly the tide of public opinion really starts to shift back into Charles's favor. People are saying, just like Colonel Blood thought, well, we've paid for those jewels, so those are ours. That's my crown. That's my money. Those aren't just jewels. They actually represent our country. They represent who we are as a society, as a monarchy. Like, these are really important things. How dare somebody go in there and try to steal them? What's wrong with you? Who gives you the right? So Charles is actually looking pretty good right now. Public opinion is starting to turn back towards his direction. So he says, okay, I'll tell you what, this man, he's tried to steal the crown jewels. Let's find out what it's about. So Colonel Blood is tested. He's interviewed. He's been asked, what were you thinking? Why did you steal these? What did you want to do with it? And he refuses to answer any of the questions. He says specifically, I will only speak to the king. That's it. Nobody else. That's just repeating it over and over again. No answers given. I will only speak to the king. So Charles is notified of this and he says, all right, bring him to me. So he's in his palace at Whitehall. Colonel Blood is brought in to see him. He's brought in front of the king. And then he says that he will only speak to the king if they are alone together. And one of the weird things about being a member of the royal family is that you are literally never alone. There are staff and soldiers and people around you all the time. And so, of course, all of the King's Guard soldiers who protect Charles are saying, yeah, absolutely not. There's no way we're going to leave the king alone in a room with a guy that just tried to nick all the crown jewels. But Charles actually says, okay. And he sends everybody out of the room. And it's just Colonel Blood and Charles in there. Now, what they said, we don't know. What we do know is that when the doors were reopened, Charles ordered all of his soldiers to stand down. And he said Colonel Blood is a free man. Now, Colonel Blood walked out of that palace, eventually out of the pages of history. And we don't actually really know what his motivation was or what transpired between Colonel Blood and the king inside that room. But what we do know is that the attempted theft of the crown jewels increased Charles's popularity beyond comprehension. And all the people that were so angry about all this money that was spent on the jewels were suddenly very patriotic and protective about them, and we're absolutely astonished that somebody would try to steal them, and we're perfectly happy for them to all be repaired and rebuilt and put back into the Tower of London. So there are some people who believe that perhaps Colonel Blood wasn't necessarily acting on his own orders, but maybe the orders of the king. Now, I believe that for now, that's probably all I have to share with you. I've been talking for 46 minutes, you guys. That's quite some time. That's about half of one of my walking tours. So I am going to bid you a fond farewell from London. There's a few things that I want to mention to you before I go. Firstly, if you're on the Free Tours by Foot page, you will have already seen that we have a number of audio guides that are available to download. After watching me, you might recognize some of the voices that you hear on those downloads. And for the time being, I want to stress this, they are free. They're normally not expensive at all. It's just a few pounds, a few dollars. But right now, we know that everybody's really struggling. We're all kind of trapped inside for a little bit. So we've made them free for you guys. So even though you can't come visit us, and I've had so many people getting in touch having to cancel their trips, you can visit us in spirit. You can listen to the audio guides. Also, the guides have photographs as well, so it's not like you don't know what people are talking about. All you have to do is kind of ignore the directions, or you can walk around your house if you want to while we tell you to go left and right. So you've got free audio guides if you want to listen to them. They are amazing. Obviously, the ones that I'm involved in are in London, but every city that we operate in all over has amazing tours. Also, here on the page, you will see that we're going to be doing virtual tours. I think the next one coming up is something to do, oh, don't hate me, team, if I'm wrong. I think it's to do with the Lincoln assassination. So that's coming up as well, but all the information will be on the page. Personally, if you were into the stories I was telling you, or you like my hair, or you have more questions about me, you can find me on YouTube. I actually don't have enough subscribers to actually have like a channel, but if you just Google my name, Margaret Stockton-Davies, it's long, but I'll write it down for you. Then you will be able to find me there. Also, if you email, if you've got any questions, you're planning your trip to London, you want to know anything about what I've spoken about or any more information, feel free to email me at Margaret, Margaret, at freetoursbyfoot.com. And if you're into your Instagram, which I know everybody is, for those of you that have been with me this whole time, as I've already said, I'm not great with technology. So I'm just entering the world of Instagram. Okay, I'm new. I'm late. I'm very late. It took a pandemic to get me to join, but there you go. I'm there as Lady Stockton-Davies, if you want to find me. So I believe that's all my plugging done. I hope that you guys had a lovely time. I hope that if you've got any other questions, you do, please send me an email, send me a message on Facebook, anything like that. I'd be happy to answer. I literally have nothing to do. So get in touch anytime you can. And I hope you guys all stay safe and say, well, so goodbye from London. Yeah, I can't figure out how to turn off. Okay, there it is.